Welcome to another Times Radio Frontline recap. I'm Philip Ingram and I'm currently presenting Times Radio Frontline, but I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer and I commentate on all matters geopolitics, defence, security and anything else that people want me to commentate on. I'm going to point you in some of our fantastic interviews this week. I'd of course recommend all of them, but the first thing I want you to have a look at is the Secretary General of NATO speaking at Chatham House on Monday.
In just 2 weeks, I will chair the NATO summit of allied leaders in The Hague. And this summit will transform our alliance. We will build a better NATO, one that is stronger, fairer and more lethal, so that we can continue to keep our people safe and our adversaries at bay. Because of Russia, war has returned to Europe. We also face the threat of terrorism and fierce global competition. Russia has teamed up with China, North Korea and Iran. They are expanding their militaries and their capabilities. Putin's war machine is speeding up, not slowing down. Russia is reconstituting its forces with Chinese technology and producing more weapons faster than we thought. In terms of ammunition, Russia produces in 3 months what the whole of NATO produces in a year. And its defense industrial base is expected to roll out 1,500 tanks, 3,000 armored vehicles and 200 Iskander missiles this year alone. Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years. 5 years. Let's not kid ourselves. We are all on the eastern flank now. The new generation of Russian missiles travel at many times the speed of sound. The distance between European capitals is only a matter of minutes. There is no longer east or west. There is just NATO. China is also modernizing and expanding its military at breakneck speed. It already has the world's largest navy. And its battle force is expected to grow to 435 ships by 2030. China is also building up its nuclear arsenal. And it aims to have more than 1,000 operational nuclear warheads also by 2030. Those who stand against freedom and democracy are digging in, preparing for long-term confrontation and trying to dominate and divide us. In 1936, Winston Churchill posed this question during a debate in the House of Commons. Will there be time to put our defences in order? Will there be time to make these necessary efforts? Or will the awful words, "too late," be recorded? And that is the question for NATO now. History has taught us that to preserve peace, we must prepare for war. Wishful thinking will not keep us safe. We cannot dream away the danger. Hope is not a strategy. So NATO has to become a stronger, fairer and more lethal alliance. A stronger NATO means spending much more on our defense. All allies will reach the initial target of spending 2% of GDP on defense this year. That was a pledge made way back in 2014. Now we have a concrete plan for the future. We know what we need, and we know what to do. At the summit in The Hague, I expect allied leaders will agree to spend 5% of GDP on defense. It will be a NATO-wide commitment and a defining moment for the alliance. There are 2 parts to this new defense spending plan. 3.5% will be invested in our core military requirements, while the rest will go towards defense and security-related investments, including infrastructure and building industrial capacity. 5% is not some figure plucked from the air. It's grounded in hard facts. The fact is, we need a quantum leap in our collective defense. The fact is, we must have more forces and capabilities to implement our defense plans in full. The fact is, danger will not disappear, even when the war in Ukraine ends. Our decisions on defense spending are driven by NATO's battle plans and capability targets. They define what forces and capabilities allies need to provide. And last week, NATO defense ministers agreed ambitious new targets.
So, Mark Rutte, what's Mark Rutte talking about? He's talking about NATO countries stepping up from the 2% of GDP that is required for NATO members to spend on defence today for being a member of NATO, to being upped to 5% of GDP, and is hoping that that's going to be agreed at a NATO conference, NATO summit later on this month. And he says that he has got support from the majority of members. Of course, the United States, the biggest spender in NATO by cash terms, only spends 3.17% of GDP, but we're getting a lot of the other nations that are spending a larger percentage, including Poland, the Baltic states, and others. But we've still got NATO nations who are not spending or are still in the path to try and get to that basic 2%, including Canada, Italy, and Spain. So how this 5% is going to go down is difficult. And the UK, of course, has just had its strategic defence review, and we had our spending review announced in Parliament on Thursday by the Chancellor. And that spending review, through smoke and mirrors, suggested that defence is now going to be 2.6% of GDP. There's very little new money in that. In fact, with the Chagos deal being put into it, it's actually, in real terms, in the first few years, a defence cut, I believe. But there was no path to 3% or 3.5% or 5%. So there's a lot of negotiations to go on around that. But Mark Rutte alluded to the fact that if we didn't start spending this, we all better start learning Russian. Здравствуйте, комрадцы. The three of the interviews I want to point you at this week, and seriously, go and listen to all of them because they're brilliant. But the first one is with Robert Fox, and Robert is an old friend.
The tactics that Russia is using on the ground, as several have been pointing out, it had been at least as expensive and crude as those of Marshal Zhukov in the latter stages of the Great Patriotic War, 44 to 45, after they'd recovered after pushing the Germans back from Stalingrad, and it was just numbers. A lot of cheap armor, the very successful T-34. We don't want to go to a lot of good air, very cheap close support, but cheaper still, of course, is the human life. It was an amazingly costly war. That's what's relevant to what's going on in eastern Ukraine at the moment. It is amazingly costly, because I think it's a pretty conservative figure that 1.4 million have been taken off the battlefield. That's killed, missing in action, prisoners, and seriously injured, irreplaceable, at a ratio of about 1:40 to 60 on the Ukrainian side. The 40, about 400,000. It's very, very costly because 6 million have been uprooted and possibly even fled. They're very cautious about their numbers. But for Russia now to have a butcher's bill of over 1 million, which seems to be pointing to, that's quite a chiller, and it is very interesting to see whether Putin's generals, and particularly the gang round him, of which Shoigu, the former defense minister, now secretary to the Security Council, is looking to be so important. Can they really afford this expense?
And as you say, that there are more of these drone attacks going on. Just today, there's been an attack on
huge.
An attack on an electronic warfare factory inside Russia. How much are the Kremlin going to be worried that this could be the start of an even wider drone campaign against the Russian military, behind the lines?
I think it's the breadth of quality rather than quantity, which is so interesting, because it's very interesting when they did the weekend attack on the 4 sites as far east as Irkutsk, going up to Siberia, that it was just so surprising. And what was so surprising is how clever the Ukrainian command was, particularly the psychological warfare command, in saying, look, we're not going to get away with trying to cover this up, say it wasn't us. And they revealed an awful lot of how it was done. And they caught the Russians by surprise and screwed up a whole lot of the motorway heavy truck TIR transportation system across whole swathes of Russia. Again, that is a big victory, the propaganda victory through social media. And what they're saying, hey, Russia, we're not going to be suckers that way again. Just watch out and see what different we're going to do. They did have a go at the Kerch Bridge. The Sea of Azov, very importantly, did some damage, but didn't get through. They were using massive devices, 2,500 kilo devices, but the Russians had enforced it. But the North Black Sea along there, the naval war that they have been winning without having a navy of their own, is going to be very, very prominent indeed. I think that what Zelensky and his commanders must now be thinking, who's going to come to our aid? They're not going to rely on Trump. They're going to rely on the goodwill of the American people, and they're going to rely on a lot of good allies around America, particularly Canada, which has a very large Ukrainian population. I think that they will be wary because this is also one of the main thrusts of the stratagems of Putin, which is to break up NATO. And to have the Canadians quarreling with the Americans, with the Brits, with their thumbs up their backside, not really knowing what to do, having been very effective before. But the Starmer leadership, frankly, from where we're speaking now, seems thoroughly confused. And it's not clear really what they aim to do in the medium to long term from the recent Strategic Defence Review. France being France, where Macron, that's a good Freudian slip, but they're the same. You see, you have Jupiter in France with the president, and they will lead Germany, very important, the Nordics, very important, and I'm not just going through the list. Italy, I think, with Meloni is going to be very important, and they're going to discount to trade, which is very difficult for Ukraine. Discount the importance and influence, particularly of Poland now. They're going to watch Poland. Poland can do a lot of things, but there will be very heavy psychological warfare, information warfare on Poland. Look, chum, if we believe what your neighbours in the Baltic states are saying and what we're saying to you, you can't dial out of this one because you're next. And you may be so next, you're probably even now, more than you realise, under threat from Russia. It's an absolutely fascinating build, but you can see this is middle late period Putin, Peter the Great, ground initiative to bring Russia back as the premier, not a premier, the premier European military power. And it is slightly bonkers, if I put it like that, but so it is.
He is talking about the Russia's ability to continue to sustain the conflict. This week we got to 1 million casualties, as reported by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence, 1 million Russian casualties. And this was supported on Thursday by UK Defence Intelligence, who agreed with that assessment and showed the increase in casualties over time that's going through. And Robert describes it as unsustainable. Now, of course, 1 million Russians, there is going to be a similar-ish number of Ukrainian casualties, and we don't know what they are. That million is made up of those that have been killed and those that are wounded. And I've discovered in operations, from operational experience, that you tend to get 3 to 4 wounded for every 1 killed. But I've been reading reports this week about how bad Russian medical services are and how anyone who is seriously wounded, if they don't get killed immediately, tend to die several days later from infection or other things because the medical care just isn't good at all. So that 1 million could be close to 1 million dead or a significant number of them. And he's then talking about the equipment losses that Russia's got and the lack of sustainability that Vladimir Putin has got to when it comes to continuing to sustain the conflict. But there are no indications at the moment to suggest that Vladimir Putin is considering that. And I personally think we've probably got another 12 months of Vladimir Putin being able to do things before it'll start to hurt him domestically. Of course, Robert then goes on and emphasises that NATO needs to accelerate what it's doing and step up much more quickly. We're hearing lots of good noises coming out of NATO nations and out of NATO leaders and European leaders. I'm sorry, Robert focuses more on European leaders, coming out of European leaders, but we're not seeing the actions exemplified by the UK government's strategic defence review, which was good, but trounced up in lots of flowery language that wasn't exact and telling the government what to do. And the government spending review yesterday that had a lot of moving figures around from different areas to try and make a bigger number in defence, when the reality is, for anyone that knows, and that includes Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, we're not spending a lot more on defence. Next video I want to throw you to is Ed Lucas.
Well, if it's not war, it feels pretty much like it. And we are in a state of intense conflict with both kinetic and non-kinetic elements, with a very wide variance in the response. So I've just been in Vilnius, and I have to say I feel safer in Vilnius than I do in London. I don't think in Vilnius you have these sort of mysterious energy system and transport system and other retail system collapses and attacks that seem to be an almost daily feature of life in this country. I think that the Russia is testing us all the time, and so far the result of their test is that some countries stand up to them very well and other countries don't. And I think that I was there for Secretary General Rutte's speech at Chatham House on Monday, and although I applaud his idea to increase our air defences by fivefold and to spend a lot of money on defence, where I would question him was when he said we've got 5 years. I don't think we've got 5 years. I think we've got 5 months. And why, as Gabrielis Landsbergis, the former Lithuanian foreign minister, said, why would Putin wait till we're ready? It's clear that Europe's on a trajectory that within 10 years, give or take a couple of years, Europe will be an enormous lump of political and military and economic power, and Russia will be a much smaller one, even in its alliance with China. Russia will be on the back foot. So why would Putin wait till we're ready? I think it's much more likely that he tries to test Article 5 quite soon, and does so in a way where perceptions vary, and the countries concerned or country concerned will say, wow, we've just been hit, we want Article 5. And the Americans will say, we don't want a euro in Europe, or don't escalate. And a lot of European countries will say, well, hang on, can't we find some way out of this? And the military response to this attack, say it's in the Baltics, would be to turn Kaliningrad into Mariupol, absolutely flatten Kaliningrad from the get-go to show where no air defense systems, no naval, no nothing there. And I don't think European countries have got the appetite for that. Most of them have. The Lithuanians would do it. Poles might want to do it. I can't see the Germans wanting to do it. And that is the weak spot. It's in our decision making. And I think that Putin is going to poke his screwdriver in there pretty hard and start wiggling.
Politics is changing across Europe as well, and we're seeing conflicts politically. We saw Viktor Orban almost do a flip-flop and turn around and say that the only way to deal with Putin is through strength. We're hearing encouraging noises from the new German Chancellor Merz, but France is in a difficult position because Macron has got an unstable government, and arguably France has always been unstable, and the rest of mainland European nations are just keeping their heads down a lot. What's your view on where Europe's going with regard to defence and in particular its ability to continue to support Ukraine if America withdraws?
Well, I think that the key thing is to keep the money going to Ukraine, because we have this sort of slightly outdated idea that Ukraine is sort of a military supplicant. Actually, it's not. The Ukrainian military-industrial complex is fantastically good at innovation and increasingly good at production, and is not running at full power because it doesn't have the money. So the most important thing I think for Europeans to do is to keep writing checks, obviously with some scrutiny and oversight. Actually, I would say place orders in Ukraine with the Ukrainian military companies, which gives them a revenue stream, and maybe say we'll pay for 100 and you get 50 and we get 50. But the balance of expertise and sort of production capability has shifted very sharply in the course of the war. I think that the idea of there being a sort of one Europe is a bit misleading. You have huge variations in terms of size of countries, and in terms of threat awareness and capability. But I think that there's a kind of large, stable, rich lump of basically well-run, politically stable, economic, political, and increasingly military power in Northern Europe. And I'm sure that all our viewers and listeners here are absolute experts. I'm not sure any of them would be able to tell us the countries that make up the coalitions in the Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, Danish, Latvian, and Lithuanian parliaments. As a matter of fact, I do know, and I can tell you there's some pretty ropey parties in some of these countries, but it doesn't really matter. Those countries are basically stable, and even Poland, which is highly politically polarized, there's a strong consensus on that. So it's not really the same problem you've got as in, say, in France, where you have quite serious tensions between the government and President Macron. Also worth remembering, the Nordic 8, the 5 Nordics and the 3 Baltics, plus Poland, those 9 countries, have a bigger GDP than Russia. And Russia, with its GDP, has to do everything. They just have to defend themselves. Throw in maybe the Dutch or the Brits, and it becomes, you've got a kind of superpower there. And the key point about this is that we are not in difficulty because we have Russian bombs falling on our cities, or tanks trampling down our streets, or our decision makers being kidnapped and taken off to the gulag. That's the experience that these European countries had when they were trying to resist Russia. No, our problem is purely about decision-making power, about our willingness to take risks, make sacrifices, stick to deadlines, do what we make a decision and implement it. And the only thing that's stopping us doing that is ourselves. So we should be both cross about the plight we're in and pretty nervous because we left it very late. But fundamentally, we can do this. Those North European countries plus Britain are plenty able, as the Americans say, to cook with what they've got in the kitchen.
And Ed is talking about the threat from Russian hybrid warfare. And we have a fantastic chat, him and I going through it. And Russian hybrid warfare, or warfare in the grey zone, is going on a daily basis across the UK, but also across Europe and into the United States and elsewhere. And it's using information operations, manipulation of the information sphere. It's using cyber. It's using assassinations. It's using sabotage. And we've been seeing that for a number of years. And actually, Ed quite boldly says he does not feel safe in London with what's going on. And he's right. If we look at what's happened over the last few years with our infrastructure creaking, but we've seen warehouses catch fire, having been attacked by individuals who've been employed by the Russians. Our information operations that are going on across the board are causing real discourse elsewhere. Almost certainly the protests that we're seeing in London that are supporting the Palestinians and other protests will have some form of Russian interference, either directly or indirectly through their Iranian partners and others. And I can see why Ed feels unsafe in London. And frankly, I have to agree with him. And of course, before this, we saw the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko with polonium-210 on the streets of London. And after that, we saw the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal with Novichok on the streets of Salisbury. And Novichok, there was enough fuse there to kill half the population of London without any real difficulty. And people tend to forget that. And we look at the cleanup operation that had to go there. And again, Ed emphasises what Robert had emphasised, that your European support and NATO support needs to step up. And we need to see more action rather than talk, because it takes a long time to build up defence capability. And that is the only way we can send a clear message to Vladimir Putin. The final video I want to point you to was a fascinating interview with Katerina Stepanenko, who is from the Institute for the Study of War based in Washington. And she's Ukrainian, and that's been working for them. And she's part of the team that puts together the daily Institute for the Study of War briefing on Russia. And I examine with her how she puts that together.
I'm truly impressed with the level of the Spider Up operation. I think it's one of the most fascinating accomplishments that Ukrainian forces were able to accomplish during this war.
From my perspective, I think there's stalemate at the tactical level in the front line, effectively. Russia is maybe advancing in territory, but it's losing at a huge cost. But I think Ukraine, and you've explained it very well, retains the initiative at the operational level, and therefore has got everyone wondering when the next spectacular is going to be and what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think in terms of the battlefield, I don't think that it's going to immediately affect the battlefield at scale, right? There might be some parts where logistics can be severed, or complicated, but I don't think that it's going to stop the Russian advances on the battlefield. I do think that with each and one of those strikes, it raises additional questions onto the Kremlin and the Kremlin's immediate circle of, is this worth it, right? Because if you're losing one of your A-50s aircraft, right, your strategic A-50 aircraft, and you only have less than 10 of them, that is a tremendous resource that you're not going to ever regain, if you don't open up, yourselves and have some sanctions lifted and so on, right? So I think this is more of a strategic play here. I don't think that the Kremlin is willing to recognize it as such. And the reason I say this is we saw the way that the Kremlin responded immediately to the Spider Rope operation. They swept it under the rug. They didn't mention it in the government meeting that Putin had, instead choosing to focus on the derailments in Bryansk and Kursk oblasts. So it's something that the Kremlin doesn't actually want to take on as a lesson and realize, maybe this war actually will cause us a lot more harm than good. The kind of similar issue we saw was when the Kremlin faced the Kursk incursion. Obviously, a lot of battlefield analysts talked about what it meant, for the battlefield situation, but it exposed a major strategic dilemma for the Kremlin, which was the Kremlin needs to protect its border. The Kremlin needs to allocate significant manpower and resources to protect its borders because its borders are not defended. Same situation here. The Kremlin needs to allocate additional resources to actually meaningfully protect its aircraft, and moving it just further into Siberia won't cut it at this point. And it's those, costs that hopefully will add up eventually for Kremlin, to actually meaningfully come to some sort of a negotiation. But until the Kremlin feels that cost both on the battlefield and within the rear, I don't think that it's possible to see an actual, peace negotiation of sorts.
But also at the strategic level, we see the relationship between Donald Trump and what he's coming out with in his language and Vladimir Putin. Is Putin playing Trump? And do you think Putin is emboldened by the fact that, if he is playing Trump, he can keep that going and that will stop him having to worry about the rest of it?
I think Putin is definitely prolonging all of the ceasefire peace conversations. He is preparing for additional offensives. He already launched several offensives and is trying to justify them as needing to protect Russian territory, particularly the Sumy offensive. So I don't think that Putin had ever indicated that he wanted to have a meaningful negotiation. He's been saying this since 2021, even under Biden administration, that they don't want anything. They didn't want the allegedly proposed 20-year pause on Ukrainian integration into NATO. It's not something that Putin ever wanted to negotiate it on. And we see this based on the fact that Putin did decide to invade, to launch the full-scale invasion. So fundamentally, I think the Kremlin's position has been actually very solid and unwavering in many ways. They're not going to be satisfied with anything that is less of Ukraine's government's capitulation and destruction of Ukrainian military.
Well, on a more worrying note, I read yesterday in another ISW report that Russia was planning to withdraw from international arms control treaties as a possible preparation for a wider conflict with NATO. Do you think there's a possibility of a wider conflict?
Of course, I think the Russians are preparing for it. We see this based on the military reforms that they're trying to do. They're trying to grow their military to, I believe, over 2 million. They're also deeply militarizing their society, so that in the event that they do have to do a Red Army style mobilization, they're going to be in a better position to do so than what they were in 2022. They are thinking about new technology, implementing, drones and building out a new unmanned systems force. All of these factors are extremely worrying. And then also the rhetoric. The rhetoric around the Baltics in recent weeks and months has been concerning. Now, it's nothing new. We've seen all of the rhetorical lines and narratives that they're putting forth against the Baltics, but the Kremlin can choose at any time to enact this as a reason for an escalation. So I think the combination of the fact that Russia is already on the military footing, the fact that Russia has thousands of men who have experience with modern battlefield innovations, and the fact that Russia is solidifying its partnerships with China, with North Korea, with Iran to leverage this new sort of type of war. I think all of these need to be accounted for as Russia can be preparing for an escalation against NATO.
And we then go on to talk about the attacks that have happened across Russia with the now almost infamous Operation Spider's Web, with the drones coming out of trucks and attacking Russian strategic bomber fleet, and the impact that is having across Russia. And the biggest impact that she talks about, that is something that I hadn't quite grasped in the same way, was the number of resources that it's taking away from Russia being able to put them to the front line, because they're now having to spend those resources in internal security, in checking lots of different trucks, in more security around airfields, moving air defences, moving early warning radars, moving anti-aircraft weapon systems around to try and protect against these, but also tying up a lot of the Russian security services and security forces going around trying to detect all of the other activities that the Ukrainians are doing, because the Ukrainians have had some huge successes in attacking railway lines, attacking oil infrastructure, attacking airfields, attacking logistic bases, assassinating generals in Moscow. And each one of those is sucking up Russian resources and is having an impact politically and militarily. And I think President Putin, and she says, is wondering where the next one's going to come from. So I strongly recommend that interview. So thank you for watching this week's recap. And please, if you want exclusive access to our updates early, please sign up for Times Radio membership. And we're now on a podcast channel, so you can get us on any of your favorite podcast outlets. Just search for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.